One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dagger, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Keatron Evans. He is the managing partner at CyberSecurity, a global information security consulting business which includes penetration testing, incident response management and consulting, digital forensics, and training. Keatron is also a senior security advisor at Savvius and a top-rated instructor for ISACA and ISACA. He is also one of the authors of Chained Exploits, Advancing Hacking Attacks from Start to Finish, a textbook still used by the U.S. government security agencies. Keatron, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
What really intrigues me of the things you've said here is that it is actually preventable, that you do have clues if you know what to look for. And, just as you said, those ones that were the major hacks, they were in previous reports. They were, let's say, somewhat known. It just wasn't, the information wasn't transferred right. So a lot of this is preventable with just a little bit of background and training. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. A lot of it is preventable, and the ones that made the news are preventable. But keep in mind, there's an entire underbelly of cyber attacks and breaches that never make it to the news because either they're classified or the organization, it's too embarrassing, so they'd rather just take the hit and not report it if they can get away with not reporting it. So I don't want to make it sound like that everything can be prevented, because there's really two classes of you getting attacked. One is you happen to just not be doing a good job of paying attention to the basic things that we're talking about, and you just happen to get caught up in a sweep where they're looking for easy targets. Or the other side of that is if an advanced persistent threat targets you, okay? So if you take one of these APT groups, advanced persistent threat groups, that are usually state-sponsored, so they're usually funded by some government organization, and they target you, then there's not a lot you can do to prevent that, okay? But if you look at a lot of the big breaches that have happened, they were still compromised by very basic things. So I don't want to make it sound like if you do these things, it's going to 100% protect you, but if you do these things, it's going to make it harder, much harder for these guys to get at you. But if they target you, and they have the funding and the resources, they're going to get in at some point, and there's really not a ton you can do about it. Now, what there is a movement for in the industry is mature security organizations. In other words, companies that have a mature security program have kind of accepted the fact that, look, we're probably going to get breached at some point, right? We're going to get hacked. So how can we continue business? What's our process for business continuity? How do we increase our ability to detect that we've been compromised? So there's a big movement in detection and response where some of the resources are being devoted to that and not so much being spent on preventative. And what that leads to is a much better posture, because if you really understand the attacks, then that puts you in a better position to know when they're happening, because now you know what the attack looks like. All right, so you'll see that it's happening a lot faster than someone that doesn't know it's happening until your data is for sale on the internet somewhere. So learning how to do the attacks and getting on the offensive empowers you to make better detection and response decisions. Now, going forward in the future, there's a lot of companies out there that are boasting things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's saying, oh, we're back to prevention now. We can truly prevent because we got artificial intelligence. And I would caution people with that. I actually have a conference coming up in Vegas for ISACA in October of 2018. And in that conference, I'll be talking about the myth, the truth versus the myth is related to how many of your cybersecurity problems artificial intelligence is actually going to solve. Because what amazes me is people seem to forget that if we're doing it, don't you think the bad guys are doing it as well? So you're going to have two AI bots competing against each other. And whenever we have that situation where the good guys and the bad guys are competing, the bad guys have won historically. All right, so it's like we keep not learning lessons. Every time we come out with the latest, greatest whiz banger, we think that's going to solve all of our cybersecurity problems, and it turns out that later we find out the bad guys have already counted on us doing that, and they've got countermeasures to get around it already. So that's kind of where I see things going now, and that's kind of some of the stuff that we should be looking out for.
Well, I like that idea, the fact that you can, you know, if you are watching, if you are not just all preventing, is that there's a lot being put into is how you can minimize the damage and react to it properly is what you're saying is just as key as prevention.
Absolutely. One other point that I wanted to bring up related to that is I would say in about half of the engagements that I do, about half the penetration tests, when we go in and do a security audit, even though we're not doing forensics, we're not doing incident response in those instances, about half of the times we find what we call indicators of compromise, where the organization's already been breached. The bad guys are already inside, and they just didn't know it. But once we go in there and start working with them and doing the engagement and transferring knowledge, they start to see some of the things that we're showing them, and they're like, oh, yeah, I think that happened, 6 months ago. Let's go take a look. And we start pulling back, layers of that onion, and we find, yeah, you've been compromised for a few years now. And they're constantly exfiltrating data out. So some of the penetration tests have turned into, forensics and incident response gigs where they said, all right, stop the pen test. It's more important that you help us recover from this breach right now. So there's another contract signed, that's different from the pen test that we were bought there for in the first place.
Well, I would like to thank you very much. What's the best way for someone to contact you? Is it through your website?
They can reach me on the website, or they can also just reach me at kevans@kmcybersecurity.com.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you very much, Keatron. I find it field very fascinating. This podcast will be available on the Business 901 iTunes Store and the Business 901 website. So I want to thank all the listeners for listening.
All right. Thank you, Joe.